Hi, I'm Barrett Ristroff. I'm from South Louisiana originally, but I've spent most of the last 10 years in Alaska. I'm now in Fairbanks, Alaska with my husband, Chief PJ Simon of Allakaket, and our son Magnus. For the last year or so, I've been talking to people in 59 villages, as well as people outside of the villages who make policy or affect policy on climate change, just to try to get an idea of how people in the villages are adapting and how the law and planning can help or hinder. Today, through this video, I want to share some of the strategies that I learned. They're in no particular order. I'll just walk through them, and PJ will help with narrating and sharing some of the messages that I got from community members. So I know that each village is unique, and adaptation is a local process. So some of what I'm saying may not be helpful, and I hope that some of it is. I would love to hear about your ideas and your experience, and I hope this video benefits you.
I want to start with climate information. How do you get enough information about climate risks to take the right actions, but not overspend or overbuild? First, recognize what you can do without precise information about erosion and flooding and changes in weather and species. There's an idea of no regrets projects that can help the community whether or not climate change happens the way it's predicted to happen. This is important because predictions can be inaccurate. One idea is to plan for projects that the community can maintain even if the shoreline changes. Maybe this involves elevation or building away from the water, maybe with a road to get to the water. If there's a potential for relocation, it can help to collect historic community knowledge about inhabitable sites. What floods and what doesn't? How did people deal with environmental change in the past? As Nathan Elswick, environmental coordinator from ANVIC, said,
We are losing a lot of elders, so it's best we start documenting them now. We want to see how things were and how things are now, so the youth can see the changes.
collecting current data can be useful if it supports subsistence or adaptation projects. For example, the local environmental observer, or LEO, can show places that are unsafe because of weak ice. Collecting other data can be useful if you can use it to get an agency to change its regulations. For instance, if you can show that moose are coming earlier, maybe you can get ADF&G to open the season earlier. Finally, collecting data can be helpful to show agencies that the community is capable of doing this on its own. As Pamela Lestinkoff, environmental coordinator for St. Paul, said,
It's important to involve community members since they are the ones who see the changes first.
beware of collecting data just for the sake of collecting data. Limited resources might be better spent on carrying out projects. This is especially true for erosion caused primarily by storms. Pamela Lestinkoff said,
If you just collect a bunch of data without a plan, it could be useless.
So, how can tribal staff get the information they need to get up to speed on climate change adaptation? I mentioned Leo. Lots of people are already collecting information voluntarily on their own through programs like this. Volunteer efforts like this are great. If funds are available, a staff member or consultant can be designated to take responsibility for covering climate change in tribal programs and plans. This person could be a liaison to agencies and universities that have climate change information and resources. The decision to hire a consultant to be a liaison is up to the tribe and depends on the tribe's situation. Some would rather work directly with agencies and researchers. Ideally, researchers and scientists from agencies would freely provide information from all their studies to communities, especially when the communities are sharing information to make the studies happen. Some communities have decided to require researchers to share information as a condition of a permit to do work in the community or with community members. Examples are King Island's Research Agreement and the Northwest Arctic Borough Code Title IX. A permit could have a fee that would help fund education and training of village residents. Also, ideally, researchers and agencies should provide funding for interpreters to put technical language into plain English or the language of village residents. In a number of cases, tribal citizens have ended up serving as volunteer interpreters. I'm showing here this triangle of information exchange that should be happening between the villages, the researchers, and also the decision makers, so no one is left out. One way to improve staff's knowledge is through training offered outside of the village. Some of this is provided at no cost to tribes. It's even better if you can bring a trainer to the community. This person could train more people for a lower cost per person, and the training could be more specific to community needs. This is a strategy shared by Fred Olson Jr., chairman of the Southeast Indigenous Transboundary Commission. He said,
Instead of sending tribal staff out for training, have the instructor come to your town and tailor the program, including the manual, to your village. Then, through the class exercises, you can actually accomplish something for your community. Think about your ultimate goal. An example, making maps for your area, as opposed to just learning GIS and match your programs to this. And one more idea about getting information is to embrace the frequent interchange between village-based and urban-based tribal citizens. There doesn't necessarily have to be all the expertise for planning and projects in the villages.
So, you've got the tribal staff on board. How do you get people in government from outside the village on board? The key piece of advice that many people gave me is,
Be persistent.
as Michelle Moses, a Latina tribal administrator, said.
Don't take no for an answer.
Michael Opheim, the environmental coordinator from Seldovia Village, shared his experience.
Every time we've had a roadblock, we smile, nod, and do what they asked. They can only throw up so many roadblocks before they have to say, well, I guess now you can go do your project. The one project that sticks out the most is the scenario of smile and nod, is our fish consumption assessment. Some agency staff did not want us to do the work we were attempting to do, saying we were not capable of such work. These are the people who are supposed to be helping us succeed and build our capacity to do such projects. We jumped through all the hoops, and in the end, we got to do our project and prove them wrong. Tribes are capable and tribal staff are smart enough to get it done. Our work may not be the Cadillac of projects, but it led the way for other tribes to step up and say, hey, we want to do this as well.
An environmental coordinator from another village said,
We need to continue teaching them our rights as First People. If we're assertive, we have more power.
Janet Mitchell, the administrator for the city of Kivalina, said,
You need to keep saying the same thing over and over again because government officials keep changing. You have to keep repeating yourselves. Sometimes you have to rock the boat to be heard, and many mistake that for whining or not working together, which is quite too often.
Janet had an important point. There's lots of agency and legislature turnover, so it's important to educate and re-educate policymakers. Tim Hammond from the Bureau of Land Management suggested that tribes work on MOUs and cooperative agreements with agencies. This can help maintain agency knowledge through turnover. Another way to handle this is to build relationships with people in the private sector who will be consistent supporters. It helps to make climate change impacts more personal to outside officials. You can provide the media and government photographs and stories of impacts. It's even better if you can bring outside officials on community tours. As one elder from Western Alaska put it,
We don't have to exaggerate that we have problems. We just have to document them.
requests for help are more likely to be fulfilled if they don't cost the government too much extra money. Land conveyances are a good example. Ideas that look familiar to decision makers are more likely to have traction. See if you can base a proposal on an existing program or a previous program or law that had support. Finally, it's great if you have more than one community entity or multiple communities working together on an issue. One congressional staff member told me that the policymakers pay more attention to AFN resolutions than resolutions from one or two villages. As Werner Wilson, Natural Resources Director for the Bristol Bay Native Association, said,
We all collectively in the villages need to come together and say, climate change is something important to us.
Chris Whitehead, Environmental Program Manager for the Sitka tribe, explained,
The only reason why we have had success and have been able to do what we've done so far was that we've been able to collaborate with other tribes. 15 tribes collaborated on ocean acidification and hazardous algal blooms. People started joining together at a staff level, which showed tribal councils that they have common concerns. It is hard for the state to ignore 15 tribes speaking as one.
Many village leaders have been able to build relationships with nonprofits and key agencies that help with adaptation, like the Federal Emergency Management Act, or FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. All of these agencies have tribal liaisons that can be reached by phone to answer questions. Sometimes, even when it's not clear who helps with what, a liaison can connect a tribal representative with the appropriate agency representatives. Another way to find out which agency offers what kind of help is to look at the catalog of federal resilience programs for Alaskan communities, which can be downloaded online. It can be helpful to meet agency representatives in person. This could be a meeting at a conference or a meeting you schedule when you go to the city for other reasons. Or you can ask agency representatives to come to community meetings or speak by phone at council meetings. As one community coordinator suggested,
You have to become familiar with which government representatives can help, so they can explain things like grant applications by phone.
Michael Opheim, environmental coordinator from Seldovia Village, said,
Forming a relationship is a good strategy. Taking the time to talk with people about their day before talking about the work that needs to be done helps. Most of the agency folks I do talk to are more like friends than they are agency staff. A lot of the time, they are just doing their jobs and are bound by laws, rules, and regulations. We need to understand that as well. Sometimes it is the agency folks being jerks, but there are good people out there who are doing the best they can with what they are limited to do.
Finally, it can be helpful to identify actions that a community can take on its own without having to get permission or help from agencies. This could be anything from encouraging community members to build on their allotments to having a community trading program where people can swap food, supplies, and services. Beyond just getting help, many villages would like to have more control over resources they need for adaptation. This could be control over land where a community might expand, control over subsistence resources, or control over federal funding. One challenge is that Alaska tribes generally lack jurisdiction over their traditional lands. This is true even though they are sovereign nations, and even though the tribe or corporation might own a part of these lands. Alaska tribes are unable to participate in some federal programs, like the National Flood Insurance Program or NFIP, because they don't have this jurisdiction. The villages that do participate in NFIP do so through their city or borough. The city or borough has a land ordinance limiting building in floodplains, which makes the village eligible for insurance and a program called Flood Mitigation Assistance from FEMA. Tribes that don't own land can sometimes cooperate with the village corporation to have a role in managing the corporation land. One example is an agreement between the native village of Barrow and Ukpiagvik Corporation about accessing corporation land. Another example is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Tribal Conservation District Program. This allows a tribe and a corporation to enter into an agreement with USDA that creates a Tribal Conservation District, or TCD. The TCD is then incorporated as a nonprofit and eligible for funding from USDA. Tyonek took advantage of this and was able to install culverts for fish passage and improving their drainage. Another option some tribes are considering is putting land into trust. This can give a tribe jurisdiction over the land similar to a state's jurisdiction or that of Metlakatla over Annette Island. Kevin Illingworth from UAF explained how Metlakatla's jurisdiction works for subsistence.
Metlakatla sets all bag limits for deer on the reservation. For salmon limits, the state negotiates with the tribe in the same way it would negotiate with Canada. The result is that native residents of Metlakatla get to take much more fish than native residents of a place like Ketchikan, which is right across the straits, because native residents of Ketchikan must follow state sport fishing rules. Another way to say it is that Metlakatla residents get enough fish to fulfill their needs, while native residents of Ketchikan do not get enough fish.
Of course, there are many pros and cons to be considered before a tribe decides to put land into trust, starting with the challenge of getting enough land to make a meaningful difference. Getting some control over wildlife and subsistence is really important even without climate change. I use the word co-management for opportunities that are specifically provided by laws, like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA Section 809, and the Tribal Self-Determination Act. Agencies may be open to collaborative management, even where it's not specifically described in a law. Collaborative efforts have sprung up on their own. An example is the Western Arctic Caribou Herd Working Group, involving state and federal agencies, tribes, and hunters. Another way to take control is to create policies to fill voids in state and federal legislation. One example is the limits that Nanwalik and Port Graham put on the harvest of eelgrass and bidarkie, with no state objection, since there was no state regulation and no competition from outsiders. Another is the Kaktovik Polar Bear Viewing Guidelines, made by a committee of entities in Kaktovik, later adopted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These suggestions are easier said than done, since tribes have to have enough funding and Western science expertise to carry out co-management or collaborative management. It's important that tribes show outside agencies that they are capable of gathering data according to Western science protocols. Chris Whitehead from Sitka said that the state of Alaska initially believed that the tribe wouldn't be able to do shellfish monitoring, but the tribe showed that it could consistently produce a lot of good quality, useful data.
The state decided to partner with the tribe on shellfish monitoring and shares the tribe's data on the state website.
Michael Opheim from Seldovia talked about a study he led on fish consumption rates among South Central tribes.
We were the first ones to do such a study, and the state has been using our data a bit for that. Our numbers were actually really close to what ADF&G got. That was one of the things that the state was so concerned about, that we were going to collect the data and it wouldn't be usable, and we proved them that wrong.
Many people know about the bowhead whale count that Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission and the North Slope Bureau did back in the early 1970s. They proved regulators wrong, and the whalers got their quota back. The lesson here is about trying to make the best of the Western science system using indigenous knowledge and ingenuity. James Kelly, Natural Resource Director for the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments, or CATG, suggested,
Show that you're capable of doing what you're tasked to do. Otherwise, you'll have restrictions. If you show you're capable, you will then be able to ask for more.
CATG used the Tribal Self-Determination Act in a unique way to get an agreement with the Bureau of Land Management to manage fire and with Fish and Wildlife Service to do moose counts. CATG has also published some of its work so it can be cited. This is helpful to increase the legitimacy of knowledge that is shared and gathered by residents. Working with universities and organizations like Alaska Native Science and Engineering Program, or ANSEP, can build Western science. As an environmental coordinator from Southwest Alaska said,
"We want to train biologists and get kids in science."
Not every tribe will have the resources to do co-management, but there are other ways for a community to have some say over federal and state decisions. With any state or federal decision, the tribe can help agencies understand who to talk to and who to meet with. Depending on the issues, sometimes the state listens more to the city or corporation, so it helps to have more than one messenger. One way to be involved is government-to-government consultation. It's a right for tribes and corporations, and it should be no cost or low cost for tribes and corporations. The Sitka tribe was able to develop their own consultation policy that all federal agencies need to follow. When a federal agency is making a decision, project, or plan that will have a major impact on the human environment, it has to do an environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Tribes or municipalities that could be affected by this decision can serve as cooperating agencies. This is a big time commitment, but it can allow the tribe to have some input before the issues go out to the larger public. If a tribe doesn't have enough time and resources to be a cooperating agency, it can still make comments on proposed decisions and speak up at public meetings on proposed projects. Having a resolution or letter signed by the tribe or multiple tribes, or the tribe, city, and corporation can get more attention.
At an individual level, tribal citizens should be encouraged to serve on fish and game and other advisory boards. Participating in board processes is certainly not always pleasant, and it can be costly, but participating offers a chance to change regulations that affect village lifeways. One important opportunity is the ability to file petitions to change hunting and fishing regulations at both the state and federal level. Anyone can file emergency petitions to change regulations, as well as petitions to change the agendas of rule-making meetings. Petitions should be filed as early as possible, and they have to fit into the emergency criteria.
Encouraging tribal citizens to vote in state and federal elections is also important. Better yet, encourage them to run for office. One senior tribal liaison to a federal agency said,
"As challenging as it is, get high-level political appointees in senior positions in the executive branch who can influence change. If I had $10 to spend, I'd tell tribes to spend it on that."
I want to switch gears now to planning. How do you plan for community services in light of climate change? Do you need a climate change adaptation plan? The answer to the second question is no. Some form of written plan can be helpful, especially for getting grants and showing what lands are important to the tribe for conservation or development. But having a simple plan that you can actually implement is way better than having lots of complex plans that nobody ever reads. A plan doesn't have to be too complex. It should clarify community priorities. This helps with funding. It should explain who will do what and who is the point of contact for a particular project. The idea is to have projects that can be implemented instead of a long wish list. A tribe can always pass a resolution to support a project that's not listed in the plan if this is needed for a grant application. As one state official told me,
"Plans are important to show priorities. It could just be 1 or 2 pages to provide to an agency."
Michael Sloan, former Natural Resources Director for Nome Eskimo Community, suggested,
When you're developing your plan, go for the low-hanging fruit. Dissect your problem and figure out what you can do about it. The solution doesn't always have to be radical.
If you can afford to work with a contractor on a plan, this can help it get done faster, but the community has to be involved if the plan is ever going to be implemented. One idea that may be cheap or free is to get help from a university student who wants to work on a plan as part of a class or thesis. Raymond Paddock, environmental coordinator at Tlingit Haida Central Council, suggested a way to help plans get implemented.
Tribal climate change plans could be incorporated into each tribe's IGAP work plan so they revisit each year or maybe even each quarter. This will give more accountability and make it a living document.
Now I'm going to get into some specific challenges and how villages have dealt with them. Flooding and erosion is probably the first thing that many people think of when they think about climate change. On their own, communities can harden, bolster, or otherwise protect critical infrastructure from floods. They can anchor fuel tanks, install culverts to improve drainage, limit building in areas that frequently flood, and put up temporary barriers prior to storms. Shaktoolik is a good example of a community taking the lead on erosion. Under the leadership of Mayor Eugene Asiksik, the city got $620,000 in grants from the Norton Sound Economic Development Corporation. They bought 2 Army surplus dump trucks, got fuel from the city, and bought gravel from Shaktoolik's corporation. They hired local workers and built a small coastal berm. With some help from sources like FEMA, communities are elevating or relocating buildings. They are protecting existing water sources from flooding or finding new water sources. As I mentioned earlier, some are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program through their cities. Community members from Gullivan explained how they've elevated their roads, which can be cheaper than building walls. A community could consider asking the military to construct erosion protection as part of the military's Innovative Readiness Training. This is a program designed to provide training while also fulfilling a community need. One thing to be cautious about is building expensive seawalls or hard armoring that may or may not be effective in the long term. It's important to consider the pros and cons. Alex Whiting, environmental coordinator from Kotzebue, described the community's experience with getting a seawall.
The seawall was helpful, but it was the demarcation point from the historic relationship people had with the shoreline of their community. There's a whole range of activities that are married to having a beach in front of your town. When that shoreline becomes a seawall, not only is it demarcation for many of those activities, but it's also a demarcation from that ancient relationship people had to the shoreline of their community, especially for the younger generation that doesn't remember having a beach as a major component of their relationship to the ocean. The reason the town is located where it is, as opposed to in the middle of the peninsula, is because of the beach and the ocean and the access and the relationship. It's a very important part of how people define themselves and relate to the environment. But the alternative was to watch your shoreline erode and your infrastructure fall into the ocean. It was like a necessary evil in some ways. It has in fact protected the adjacent road and infrastructures. At this point, it seems to be more or less be working.
In Alaska, like in most places, erosion and flooding are closely tied to disasters. Community members shared strategies with me for dealing with disasters, both before and afterwards. Communities like Gullivan have storm watchers who stay up all night at the school during a disaster so they can let the community know what's going on. Communities are practicing for emergencies by gathering in the school and participating in the National Weather Service's Storm Ready program. Some are encouraging families to have emergency kits that will last until additional resources arrive. There's often a lag time before state and federal aid comes through. It's important to think ahead to what recovery will be like after the storm or disaster is over. Carol Oliver, environmental coordinator from Gullivan, explained.
It can be helpful to have a communications plan for explaining storm damage to officials outside the villages. Sometimes the extent of damage is not apparent until the spring melt, so it is important not to state that there is no damage. The state tends to call the city mayor, who may not know what to say.
Several Alaska communities have learned the hard way how complicated it can be to recover from a disaster, even with FEMA assistance. Villages like Galena, Eagle, Allakaket, and Alatna, which were nearly destroyed by floods, can share strategies. One is to be ready to tell FEMA what your community wants to do. Often, there are no second chances to say what you want. Alatna knew that it wanted to relocate to higher ground. Their leadership was able to negotiate a 1-year time frame for rebuilding the community instead of the usual 3 years. Alatna turned down temporary housing to increase investment in their long-term housing. A community may want to have a simple village agreement or plan for disaster recovery, indicating where and how the community wants to rebuild. For example, do they want to move up on a hill? Do they want to make space for renewable energy? Eagle Village was already planning to move to nearby higher ground, so when an ice jam destroyed the village, they knew where they wanted to go. A number of communities are working to get access to a rock quarry, so they have a source of gravel ready for recovering, expanding, or relocating. It could be helpful to have a training led by experienced community members on how to build houses with support from an outside entity like Cold Climate Housing. As one elder from the interior said,
The community should find a way not to spend $400,000 on one house. Stretch money out with self-help. There is a need for more self-help. Local people used to be able to at least start housing construction even if outside help were needed to finish it. It's important to understand ways to get support for subsistence, which is normally not covered by FEMA after disaster. It may be possible to get what's called Other Needs Assistance from FEMA to pay for damage to subsistence infrastructure. There is a need to educate government on the cultural significance and full scope of subsistence activities and infrastructure so they understand that store-bought food is not an adequate replacement.
disaster and relocation can go hand in hand, but a number of communities would like to relocate before they experience disaster. This is such a difficult topic. There are no easy answers. One thing a community may want to do is start a conversation to brainstorm all options that would be acceptable and feasible for the community, with an understanding of how relocations have occurred in the past.
Is there any desire to relocate along with neighboring villages and share infrastructure?
Is there a way to move to land already owned by a corporation willing to work with the village? This could be a gradual move like Nulato in the early 1980s, or a quick move like Nuiqsut in 1973. Allakaket is also gradually moving to higher ground that they got incorporated into their city after the 1994 flood.
Can community members move any of the houses on their own? Can community members take the lead in building houses?
Is there willingness to move people first and get infrastructure later, like Nuiqsut? In that case, the state is required to supply a school at the new site if there are enough children. Kevin Illingworth from UAF suggested.
Local people are better able to identify all options instead of all or nothing. There will not be a one-size-fits-all solution.
Once a community agrees on what it wants to do, the next step is to put it into action. A community may be able to get a university to help with site selection, soil assessment, archaeological clearance, and surveying. Ideally, infrastructure at the new site can be more appropriate for the environment than much of the current infrastructure we have throughout Alaska. The Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, or ANTHC, and Cold Climate Housing Research Center have designed models of Arctic infrastructure that could hopefully be put to use. It would be good to have small systems designed to serve single homes instead of big infrastructure that's hard to maintain, let alone move. An example is the village of Kiana's work on composting toilets. Shaktoolik's 2016 Strategic Management Plan actually calls for an ordinance requiring new community infrastructure to be movable. Most communities, even if they completely relocate, will need a way to get back to the old site located on the water and near subsistence areas. Ideally, this can be planned in advance. Planning for some sort of access can be useful even if a community is staying put. An example can be found in Kaktovik's 2014 Comprehensive Plan. It included an action item to coordinate with the Air Force to seek public easements or ownership of land for an access road along the coast for subsistence activities. Consider the potential for land trades along the access corridor and whether it makes sense to build an actual road. An example is Alatna. After the 1994 flood that led to relocation, Alatna got hazard mitigation funding for a road from the new site to the river to ensure access to subsistence and to facilities in Allakaket, including Allakaket's airport. Under current law, if relocation takes place through a FEMA buyout, no permanent structures are allowed to remain at the old site. The old site could still be used for subsistence or culture camp. If relocation takes place without FEMA, outside of a disaster, it may be easier to maintain dual residence for some period of time. Announcing plans to relocate can reduce investment in the current location. This leads to worry about how people are going to maintain health and safety until a new site is developed. Nuiqsut avoided this by undertaking a very quick relocation and putting up with no amenities at the new site for some time. A community that does not want to take this approach may need to figure out how to do something like a site expansion instead of a relocation. Building a road between the two sites may be something to consider. It's also important to consider what the community needs to have at either site to make it livable, and where they want to put their funding and efforts. A federal agency native liaison offered this advice.
If a village wants to relocate, there is a need for the village or tribe to establish a threshold as to when to stop funding infrastructure in the current site and when to start funding infrastructure at the new site. Once that decision is made, the only work that should be done at the old site is the minimum needed to maintain the health and safety of its people. The community leadership should look for opportunities to trade land for higher or safer ground and build better, sustainable, weather-resistant, and energy-efficient homes and infrastructure. An example is from Crooked Creek, where the nonprofit Samaritan's Purse worked with the state of Alaska and Cold Climate Housing Research and the citizens to build new houses after a devastating flood that were very fuel efficient. They thought it through before they rebuilt. They didn't just rebuild using outdated building practices and materials that do not meet the need of the families.
I'm going to switch to another topic that's just about as important as where you live, and that's what you're going to eat. Some communities are looking at ways to raise their own food, whether this is getting a greenhouse like Igiagik, or arranging for hatcheries or herding. Different species, and even invasive species, may be potential food sources. An example is the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, or ADF&G's wood bison reintroduction. In 2015, ADF&G released 130 bison near Shagaluk. Most of the herd is within 50 miles of Shagaluk, though some animals have ranged north along the Yukon. Of course, not all invasive species are good food, and some, like pike, can harm what is good food. The native village of Tyonek has held pike derbies to get rid of pike. Another strategy involves reviving or continuing to practice traditional skills to hunt and adapt. One interior community leader described how knowledge that had been limited was reborn as a way of adapting. He said,
10 years ago, only a few elders were getting whitefish. Now, since salmon have declined, more people are learning to fish, cut, and preserve whitefish. This is also true downriver with the muskrat population, which is returning. Younger people may not have the skills to trap muskrats, so elders are showing young people how to trap them.
"The issue of bycatch is a bone of contention in Alaska, something worthy of federal attention. Limited bycatch donation programs exist, such as Sea Share, if villages are willing to accept bycatch. Some would rather just catch the fish themselves. In some instances, villages have voluntarily foregone hunting or fishing for the sake of conserving a species. Steve Ivanoff from Unalakleet explained how the community agreed to a voluntary moratorium on hunting moose for 3 years.
There was only one violation in 3 years. They eased back into moose hunting gradually over 5 years.
The idea was to not wait for the state to take action. Take it yourself. Tribes are taking matters into their own hands in many ways. One example is Kotzebue's program that subsidizes hunting supplies for those who hunt for elders. While many are doing more smoking and drying of fish at the household level, a number of tribes have worked to provide community freezers and meat processing areas. An example is Kaktovik's community ice cellar supported by renewable energy. One more way in which tribes are working on food security is to monitor food so they know when it's not safe to eat. An example is the Sitka tribe's shellfish monitoring program. Earlier, I talked about the politics of getting more control over subsistence. Here, I want to add a little more about ensuring subsistence opportunities. I mentioned the resource of Local Environmental Observer, which can report subsistence obstacles and hazards, as well as diseased animals. I'll go over a few other things that can improve safety and access. Many people take advantage of online forecasting resources, like the National Weather Service, that can help predict weather and ocean conditions. Ocean boating safety and communications can be improved by having automatic identification systems, or AIS, capacity on subsistence boats, and maintaining conflict avoidance call centers for safety purposes. One more idea to improve safety and access is to repair trails damaged by flooding and erosion. This is a way to use FEMA funding to support subsistence. Now I want to talk about protecting what some people call natural capital, habitat to support subsistence resources. As Paul Williams said,
With proper care, the land is really supportive.
there are a lot of grants out there from agencies as well as private nonprofit foundations for projects that restore or enhance habitat areas. An example is something that Elam is working on, planting trees along a fish-bearing water body to keep temperatures cool. One more thing. It's good to speak up about important habitat areas during scoping and public comment periods for agency decision-making. It helps agencies justify decisions that protect habitat. I've talked a lot about strategies that directly affect the environment. The message I got from many villages is that adaptation needs to be holistic, not just taking care of flooding while forgetting about other problems. With that in mind, I want to talk about some of these other areas that can't be left behind when thinking about how to adapt. One concern is how to protect community health and well-being to make good decisions regarding adaptation and other challenges. As one tribal administrator in the interior said,
We've got to address diabetes, addictions, and education, basically well-being. There is a need for wellness in the community and wellness training.
It can help to have a tribal court, counselors, and a public safety officer there in the community to address whatever problems come up. Local mentorships, instead of just outside trainers, can be a source of empowerment. Many have expressed the need for a more culturally based curriculum that would better retain students. One example could be the Learning Through Cultural Connections curriculum, which brings together Western science on Aurora Borealis with Inupiat culture and language. You can find their video on YouTube. Culture Camp is another source of what some are calling cultural capital, as is concerted efforts by elders and parents to pass down their knowledge and values. There are many ways in which families and individuals adapt on their own, especially when it comes to hunting and fishing. But there are some issues, like relocation, where families may want to act together as a community. It's easy for an outsider to say this, but for many reasons, it may not be so easy for the community to come together on a decision. Tribal leaders shared their thoughts with me on how to bring the community together and build what some people are calling social capital. One of the main things I heard was the benefit of having regular meetings, preferably with food. Chief Don Charlie from Nanana described the community's quarterly dinners.
We call it community safety and village pride. People go there and they don't drink, they don't smoke. We have food and door prizes. All the entities are invited, the city, the school, the churches, the corporation, the tribe, and then we each give a report on what we're doing. We have it every 3 months. I think one of the reasons communities are bickering against each other is that they don't know what this part of town is doing. All they hear is rumors.
Elder Paul Williams from Beaver said,
Eating together is where all of the good feeling and friendship and renewal of life come from. That's why we have potlatch.
aside from shared meals, there may be other activities that build culture and spirituality, like culture camp and language learning. Paul Williams said,
When you learn the native language, you're learning a lot of things that are intertwined with paying respect, because that's the right thing to do.
A community coordinator from the West Coast talked about the importance of the relationship between the tribe, city, and village corporation.
When the three village entities get together, they are a powerful force.
Again, it's not easy. One tribal administrator from the interior made sense of it this way.
Having so many different entities can be divisive, but it shouldn't be, because tribes and corporations play different roles. We should not be perpetuating the idea that corporations are against tribes.
Strong communities often have strong leaders. It's not easy to be a leader that can serve the needs within the community while also trying to attract attention and help from outside the community. It can be helpful to have regular elections, policies to guide conduct, and regularly rotate leadership positions so more people get a chance. Strong education and training are important to build up leaders. This doesn't just mean youth leadership programs sponsored by outside entities. It can also be something incorporated into culture camp. Let's be honest, cultural capital and social capital are extremely important, but every person and community needs some sort of financial capital if they're going to adapt. So now I want to talk about how to get enough funding and economic security to support the community through hard times. Many village residents talked about the importance of promoting the local economy and local resource use, whether this is tourism, mariculture, resource development, a fish processing plant, or a locally owned store. Many community plans call for more job training. One area that could be highly beneficial is training in the disaster and emergency arena, so villages can rebuild themselves from disasters. Another idea is to encourage community members to volunteer and swap services with each other rather than paying an outside source.
Several village community plans are considering the potential for roads to other villages and or the road system, which could allow for the inter-community exchange and reduce the cost of living. A community could also consider the potential for building winter ice roads in cooperation with developers.
Related to economic security is energy security. How many times have we heard of people worried about choosing between food and fuel? Climate change may reduce heating cost, but it may increase the risk of storms that could knock out power and delay shipment of fuel. Some villages are addressing this by partnering on renewable energy projects like wind turbines. Others are promoting energy efficiency and weatherizing. Villages like Tanana and Fort Yukon are using local biomass, which can employ local people to gather wood and reduce the risk of wildfire. I want to wrap up with ideas for getting and keeping grants. It can be really hard to find the resources in terms of staff and matching funds to be able to apply for grants. Sometimes you can include in your grant application funding for staff training, which can help staff fulfill grant requirements. Sometimes there are creative ways to meet matching requirements and pool resources. Agencies may accept in-kind contribution of worker hours. Another in-kind contribution could be space. A tribe may be able to share office space with a corporation or city. It may be able to cooperate with the school to use classrooms after hours. A corporation may be able to assist a tribe with accounting or other services. And there are many more potential partners out there. It can help to get diverse viewpoints to fully vet project proposals, including allies from the university and tribal citizens who've left the village. Another piece of advice is to think creatively about how to fit existing tribal objectives into grant opportunities. Fred Olson said,
Think of what you want first and try to see how you can fit into an existing program. The existing programs are designed around what the national agency wants, which may not be exactly what the community wants, but sometimes, when the language is general, you can find a way to fit your project in.
Fred was able to get a brownfields grant to support access to and gardening in sites with traditional importance to Kasan.
In our area, we have 35 former mine sites. One of them became a Superfund site. Downstream from some of them, we have some of the documented traditional garden sites. Brownfields are all about reuse. You don't just clean up for cleanup's sake. Customary and traditional gardening is a reuse of brownfields. When I first presented this to the EPA officer, there was a long pause on the phone.
But Fred persisted and was able to get the grant. It's great when you can cooperate with other communities on plans and grants. An example is the Climate Change Adaptation Plan put together by Nome, Solomon, Council, and King Island. Another example is how Nanwellick, Port Graham, and Seldovia work together on electronic waste. They take turns paying for the waste from all three communities to be shipped out at one time. It's also great if you can help others, even if you don't see an immediate payback. Fort Yukon let other communities use its grant application as a template. St. Paul created smartphone apps to share with other communities to monitor changes in the Aleutians. As one leader said,
Throw a bigger net, catch more fish, help more people. The resources are there to help multiple people. The problem is that not everyone has the language to access these resources.
Knowing what to say is critical, one interior leader said.
The right words are like the code to a combination lock.
In your grant application, try to use words that funders use in their requests for proposals and their material on the internet. It may help to specify the type of climate change rather than using the words climate change.
Югaq mana atulqa pinniut qarput agaayut munlu.
Finally, a couple of housekeeping rules.
Apply for grants well in advance. There are often delays with trying to upload the application parts.
Have clarity on grant rules and expectations from the beginning to avoid expensive mistakes that risk future funding. Michael Opheim offered some wisdom on interacting with agencies once the grant is awarded.
Tribes should not worry about agency site visits or audits. These are good things. We can all improve what we are doing, and maybe an audit will bring to light something that was missed or done incorrectly under a grant. This is good because now we can do it correctly from then on because we are made aware of it. Site visits by agency staff are good too because they can see the actual project and maybe see how paperwork is being done and suggest things to make the project better or improve how tribal staff does something.
In closing, communities have many areas of importance to them along with climate change. It's great when you can do something that addresses climate change and serves other needs, like renewable energy or employing people to build new infrastructure. Finding ways to bring the community together and build relationships with allies can help with multiple goals. Also, finding ways to better navigate state and federal systems, like those for grants, is important, but so is hanging on to everything that's great about your community and culture. The more that adaptation is led by the community rather than outsiders, the better. Alaska Native communities have adapted for thousands of years. Now is not the time to panic, but to recognize traditions of adaptation and take steps to protect your community. Some final words of wisdom from a scientist for the state of Alaska.
Using modern technology and tools for community-based decision-making doesn't mean giving up local culture and values. It does, however, require that both the users of scientific information and those conducting science bridge a communication gap.
Robert Suluk, president of the Native village of Diomede, said,
"We do adapt. Even animals adapt. We've adapted throughout thousands of years of change. We live in two worlds, our native world and the Western world. We have a complicated life here."
From Michelle Moses,
"We are an adaptable people. It's in our blood to change when we're pressed. Our ancestors have lived through a lot."
From one interior leader,
"Corporations come and go. Governments come and go, but the people and what we do remains."
and from another,
If hardship happens again, people like us will adapt and find a way to eat and live. Other people think money is going to save them. You can't eat money. I don't even think money would make good fire to keep warm with.
from a Western Alaska resident.
How do you self-motivate? You need to recognize what you can do, even if this is not the best thing, and build on small successes. It helps build self-respect for the community.
And from another,
If you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping in a small closed room with a mosquito.
I want to thank all the people that shared their information with me. A huge thanks to Bumua and Bill Stevens for letting me use their music. I also want to thank Chief PJ Simon and the Alakakan tribe for their support. And thanks to NOAA's Sectoral Application Research Program for funding my PhD work. And thank you for watching. Please feel free to get in touch or go to the link shown here if you'd like copies of the written material that I based this video on, or if you want to share questions, concerns, or strategies.